So as I was saying, the case for field creation is quite strong because we have a great deal of talent individually, we have our small clusters, but as you begin to realize that we're actually in the hundreds and potentially thousands, it's good to try and name that and try and find the patterns that actually are implicit and make them a little more explicit, not so much for our own sake, because we can already feel the commonality of purpose, but for the outside world that we're trying to reach. It's useful for them to say, that comes from that group of people, and they have a name and they have a kind of some familiar faces and they have an underlying philosophy and they have a well-known established purpose. And I guess what I'm saying is we're at the very early stages of that. And it's good to try and, one of the things we should be about is doing that work so that we're not just isolated agents, but we are in some way more than the sum of our parts, which is not to say we collapse into one big amorphous heap and that we lose all our distinctions. One of the mistakes we make in these big gatherings is assuming that we're somehow all the same. That's not the case. There'll be differences of politics, differences of generations, differences of values, even if you begin to push it hard enough. Might be some very heated, contested issues in the room that we struggle with. Now, I'm going to come to one of them in a minute, just briefly to run through the others. I went from the idea of field creation to speaking of epoch. I really do think we're in a time between worlds. I don't think that's just a pretty turn of phrase. I don't think it's just a mystical, poetic notion. I think there's a very real sense in which you can empirically show, based on patterns of supply and demand, technological infrastructure, demographic change, a range of hardcore empirical factors, that there's a meaningful sense in which modernity is ending. And that includes capitalism, it might even include democracy, but there's a slow death of the world we have known that will take place over several decades, but we're already quite deeply in it. And it's not clear what will arise from it. And that's what gives rise to the language of collapse on the one hand, or coercive authoritarian control on the other. Now, that's what they sometimes speak of as the third attractor. But another way of thinking of this is there's an open question about just how deep that change is. To say we're in a time between worlds for some is, oh, it's socially and politically a bit turbulent. But there are others who believe that actually technological developments are such, particularly with synthetic biology and gene editing, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, that we're looking at an entirely new conception of the human being, entirely new conception of life. Now, at the moment, that's still quite niche, and it's still a sort of promissory note, arguably a very terrifying note, but it's nonetheless part of the sort of possibility space in which we all move. Others feel that it's really just a matter of getting to a different kind of ecological and institutional settlement, and that it's really just a kind of another wave of cultural evolution that we'll have to surf. So there's a debate, a live debate about how big the transition we're in is. But I think for me, it's a premise that we're in a time between worlds. I move on to method, and I think one of the things that I think the method should be characterized by in terms of our way of working is that we're proactively aware of immunity to change as a premise. That we recognize that all the rah, let's change business is arguably wasting a lot of energy. That immunity to change is a feature, not a bug of the human condition. And that it's not easy to target it, but that is the work. And what we can offer for that kind of challenge is to recognize that not only is the world in transition, but in a fascinating and challenging way, the world is three worlds. It's an objective world, a subjective world, and an intersubjective and interobjective world. To put it more simply, it's the world of processes and events and atoms and molecules. It's the world of thoughts and feelings and longings. And it's the world of discourse and argument and symbols and institutions and text. And these worlds coexist, they're part of the same world. But nonetheless, they are distinct in their own way. When you reduce them down philosophically, ontologically, epistemologically, and axiologically, in other words, their reality, how we know them and what their value is and how we value them are different. And those three worlds matter. And I think the way we should build our method has to be, on the one hand, a deep grasp of immunity to change, and on the other, a relationship between this, what we call systems, souls, and society. That's our tagline. But at the event, you might hear someone like Daniel Schmachtenberger, for example, speaking about infrastructure, social structure, and superstructure. It's kind of horses for courses in terms of the language, but this three world hypothesis is now, I think, again, a kind of premise for me at least. And then I move on to Ethos, and this was the post I think that people liked the most because it was perhaps the most playful. And I spoke about how in this time between worlds we have to become bouncers, midwives, artists, and undertakers. And these were the kind of new emerging archetypes. And what I was speaking about is the need to allow the world to die well, with dignity, the undertaker, the need to keep away certain things and not to let anything, not to let everything die, to fight for certain things, to keep some things out. Yeah, hospicing and midwifing is also another good way of putting it, Sherry, in the chat there. But basically the bouncer is stopping fascism, stopping the collapse of democracy, stopping the logging of the trees. The bouncer is still there to keep away the forces of destruction. It's not just about letting everything fall apart. The artists are the visionaries, broadly conceived, those who are trying to create new worlds through imagination. And the midwives, I think, are in some ways the one that's not thought about enough, but there are so many nascent, promising projects in the world, so many new innovations, so many new ideas. They're about, new forms of money supply, new forms of peer-to-peer cooperation, new relationships of the commons, new forms of food, vertical gardens. I could go on and on and on, and most of you will have heard all of them. But they are precious, but extremely fragile. Many of these things die for lack of funding. They die for lack of mentorship. They die for lack of care. So the midwife function is there to kind of protect the newborns, the need for neonatal care for our best ideas. And that's kind of, I get into more about the ethos, post-conventional and various forms of that. But to get to the main point, resolve, I think we have to get real. And by get real, what I mean really is in groups such as the ones that we're used to meeting, full of great people, and I don't mean by this following comment to be disparaging in any way, but there's something about the dynamic, whether it's because we like to be nice to each other, or whether it's because we can't handle the tension of really getting to the heart of the matter, that we tend to be very nice, and we tend to presume a level of commonality of purpose that may not be there. So we invariably invoke a we that should respond to a certain problem, but there isn't necessarily that we in the room. There isn't necessarily that commonality of vision and purpose. It's often presumed. And this is a problem at every scale of the problem, from the family, from the relationship, the couple, to the family, to the community, to the nation, to the family of nations around the world. It manifests particularly on climate change when we speak about we have 10 years to reduce carbon by X, Y, Z. The we there is the heart of the matter, and we have to really contend with what we mean by it. We're actually afflicted by our own grammar in this respect. It's a non-trivial problem. Many languages have only one word for we, and it really stops us from actually making sense about what we have to do and who has to do it. So from resolve, we get to goal. And the goal is distinct from what I call the entelechy at the end, the ultimate realization. The goal is something more about what we focus on in the short term. And I think particularly because it's happening in the US, vis-a-vis your current political entanglements, let's say, I believe the goal should be as no less and no more than the survival of open societies. Now, open societies has an old history. It comes from Karl Popper back in the 40s, the famous book, Open Society and Its Enemies. There's an Open Society Foundation, which is one of the biggest NGOs in the world. Open societies, it's understood in a limited way as just liberal democracy. But really what we're talking about here is the principles of free life that we've come to take for granted. The West has become a little jaded in thinking about free markets and free elections and free speech as somehow not good enough to deal with our collective action problems. And that might be true. No doubt there's a need for the revitalization of these things. But it's also true that, as our friends in Ukraine have shown us, these things are worth fighting for, that they are precious historical achievements without which we will struggle to find the forms of innovation and reimagining that are called upon as the world changes and becomes something new. So the threat of fascism is very real. It's already taken hold in about half the world, give or take. I mean, the word fascism, we can argue about, when we should use it, but the notion that democracy is not the norm anymore, that it's actually something that's a plant that's beautiful but withering, is something we have to attend to very seriously. That's why I think that when I say the goal is survival of open societies, I don't just mean we're fine as we are. On the contrary, it's the things that we're taking for granted that we have to revitalize in order to have a chance to actually change the world. The mechanisms of change need to be free, creative, and open, which is why that, I feel, is the goal. But it's not the entelechy, it's not the ultimate realization, it's not the vision in the sky. The word entelechy is roughly means possibility becoming actual. So when I first met my colleague Ivo, whom you'll see in Austin, he actually, I didn't know this word. It was new to me. He said to me, Jonathan, I wonder what your entelechy is. And I was like looking at my arms, like, what's he talking about? What is that thing? And he means, what are you meant to become? Like, what is it? What are you in the process of becoming? And what would it mean to realize that? And of course, he's a coach, and so that's the kind of language coaches use. But it's a real thing for societies too. What is our entelechy? What is the story of the world turned out well? What is the vision of functional institutions, ecological sanity, social harmony, and just enough political excitement to keep us keen? What is the vision of that world? Now, it's not easy to articulate because it's beyond the horizon. And that's really what I want, and I've written about that in the piece. If you speak of it in conventional language with the concepts we have, you could well just not really get anywhere new. To get to somewhere really new, you're looking at the language of metaphor, you're looking at deep bodily felt sense, you're looking at dreams, imagination, possibly even plant-based supports, but we're looking at a kind of re-envisaging of the world. And in timescales, it's very useful, and this is the last point before I get to the end. I find it quite helpful to think, I mean, the three horizon model from McKinsey is well known, but to put it in a language that's easier to remember, you have your kind of triage phase, which is something like the next 15 to 20 years, where it's about how do you avoid things falling apart? How do you make sure that the next election in the US is held on free and fair terrain? How do you ensure that the rest of the Amazon rainforest is not cut down? Things like stop the worst stuff from happening is triage. Transition is more about the kind of new infrastructures. So the change in the energy supply, complete overhaul from fossil fuels to renewable energy, that would be part of the transition. But then the transformation, the world that is not modernity, the world that is radically different and hard to conceive, that we will almost inevitably end up in, for good or bad. It is part of the job of the visionaries, the seers, the poets, to begin to bring this world into being, knowing that the world that we're part of is dying. I know it's grandiose, but that is honestly how I see it. It is a kind of commitment to that view. Now, in that context, the big question is, where is God, right? And I say that because one of the biggest things that will divide any given group is the extent to which it's up to us and what it means for it to be up to us. Because for some people, we're all we've got, whatever you think of humanity and the more than human world, however much you want to rely on other species, or you feel that humanity has to get out of the way in some way, for many people, finding human agency and more of it, spreading it throughout the population, being inspired by great civil and social rights movements to mobilize the masses, to defend the planet, to save ourselves from ourselves, for that to have some kind of spiritual heart that is more than just good vibes, but actually meets human spiritual needs for a sense of being at home in the cosmos, it's a non-trivial task, because at the level of fundamental worldview, the world remains somewhat divided. Now, the way this plays out in my life is that I have colleagues and friends who think the whole idea of changing the world is a fool's errand. They think, we're not in control, get over yourself. You need to work on yourself, align yourself with the divine in some way, and listen to your calling and follow that. But the notion that we can mobilize agency by force of will, they consider erroneous. On the other hand, I have other people who say that's just an excuse not to mobilize yourself, not to wake up, not to take responsibility for the challenges of our time. On the contrary, whatever you believe God to be, whatever you believe the Spirit to be, the calling is for us to act with greater wisdom and discernment and conviction than we ever have, including all that's required to bring the impossible we with us, right? So that's this problem space as I see it. I don't know the answer to it, but that's how I see this sort of terrain on which the Emerge story plays out, with the healthy debate that it needs, but with the clarity of purpose that hopefully that brings. So
I want to get your perspective. I want to lean in a little in the way that you did so beautifully with Jeremy Lent. I wasn't live on that call, but I did listen to it. And I loved how you embraced his vision for this third chapter and then kind of lean into him on, okay, boots on the ground, like, okay, let's ground this. So I have a sense for me where my wires cross as an educator is that there's the difference between a developmental process, right, in the realization of God, and then a spontaneous realization of God, depending on whatever level of development you're on. And so I feel like that's where I'm curious, and maybe you'll have a different answer for triage and transformation and transition and transformation. But I do feel this longing for a little more guidance from somebody with your beautiful meta perspective on some suggestions besides bring your unique self, have the tough conversations, you know. So if you could just speak to that a little bit, I imagine you will be for the rest of your life as well, but I'd love to hear what's on top of mind for you today. Thank you.
So it's such a good question. I want you to try and, like, you've articulated it clearly and in a friendly and fair way, but if you could be more direct, like if you were going to say, put it in a more brutal way, are you fed up of something? Like, how would you frame this in a way that was a little more unguarded?
Okay, so I would frame it this way, like, okay, Jonathan, I'm with you on the vitality and the God piece, and I'm totally with you on being a bridge to people who may have different perspectives and wanting to like lean in with them. So my question would be, you know, you're sitting in front of a fundamentalist Christian who is certain that Jesus is the way and you are going to hell if you don't have Jesus as your savior. How do you lean in and talk to them about politics, social justice? Okay.
Okay, good. Great. So I have a slightly better feeling for the question now.
Okay.
Well, this is where I in the resolve piece where I speak about getting real, this is the kind of meat of that discussion. And the answer is to first of all realize that those fundamental differences are not going away. In other words, the point of the conversation that you want to have is not to find some common ground. The divergence of the opinions and the variation of values and the incommensurability of values and the range of worldviews is an endemic feature of the world. Conflict is baked in. And take a breath, because like we don't really hear that enough. We kind of are dimly aware of it, but we still often talk and pretend as if somehow all we really need to do is get this commonality of purpose together. Now, we do have to get commonality of purpose, but we do it sort of because of and in spite of and as a result of the irreducible plurality of the world. In other words, we cannot get beyond that. That's a beautiful feature of life, but it's a dark and difficult feature too. So the fundamentalist Christian, the Trump voter, the sociopath, the narcissist, they're all part of the world. Now, what does it mean? I think it just means that when we're speaking of future plans, whether it is triage, transition, or transformation, that we sense check the plan against the reality of those people being there. I don't think it's about them becoming more like us. Assuming there is an us here, if you know what I mean. I think it's more about a wholehearted, and this is why love is relevant, because you can love without expectation of change. In fact, that's the point of, in the Christian tradition, the ferocity of love is that you don't really expect necessarily, that it's not conditional in that way. Right. So that's my only answer there is, it's a sort of difficult relief to realize that we're never going to be on the same page, but we are on the same planet somehow. I find it helpful. It sort of, it releases a lot of wasted energy. And then you can actually focus on what can you love about that person. So someone mentioned food, I think, Skylar, can you have a meal with them? Well, that's a start, Can you agree that you like something together about that meal? Might that lead somewhere? Maybe, but let's not overpromise, So that's how I see it. Yes to scope for common endeavor, common love, shared interests, but equally clear-sighted conviction that we're not going to be the same.
So even though you might argue that the common ground is vitality, or the common sky is vitality, right? You wouldn't expect or anticipate that we would share a common ground politically, socially, environmentally, and to not seek for that ground, which is what we have a tendency, if only everybody would think like us.
Right,
if we could
right.
just, okay.
Right, so the reason I like the question, and it's rich terrain, is that it's also the reason why I was a little wary of Jeremy's vision. I have to read his books to give it a proper crack of the whip.
Fair.
But because I spent quite a few years of my professional life, I ran something called the Social Brain Project for several years at the RSA. And the basic point of that was look into human nature more deeply, axiomatically, discover how automatic we are, how socialized we are, look at our evolutionary patterns, try and find some kind of premise on which to build public policy. Now, it's not a mistake, but when you do that, you realize the limits to anything that's about trying to reduce something to an axiom, because there are always alternative worldviews.
Right.
And I'm just going to turn off that annoying WhatsApp noise, but I can't seem to find it.
It may be mine.
Okay, well, somebody's anyway. Such is life. Yeah. But no, it's basically that notion of, if only we could get to first principles, find out who we really are, then somehow everyone will agree on that. Political powers of be will get behind it. There's no scope for disagreement, because look, here's the science, here's the philosophy, this is who we are, and onwards. I don't buy it. I don't think that model of change is going to work. I think people will always see the world to some extent as they are, not as it is. And they'll see through the prism of their own biases, assumptions, and backgrounds. And there's nothing we can do about that. But that is a feature of the world. It's not a bug. And therefore, the notion that we'll ever come around a common set of assumptions that won't be contested and a little bit unstable, I think is utopian in the unhelpful sense.
We all have our immunity to change.
Yeah.
We're all stuck in our epigenetic fields, and we got to work that.
Certainly. So who is keeping track of who is next? Thanks, Sarah. Is that enough for now? Is that?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. That was beautiful, helpful.
And then who wants to tell me who's next?
In capture, there is what I would call a mood in the Robert Solomon, Texas philosopher sense of a persistent emotional state that creates a predisposition for action. Right. And I don't know exactly how to describe the mood, but the late Terry Patton used to talk about lighthearted sobriety. I've said cheerful realness. That's how I sign my emails. There's this, I don't know if it's a polarity, but there's this real capacity to embrace the most deep, dark depths of what's troubling and suffering, and simultaneously say, I'm here to do something. It's really hard to do that. And then it's even harder to then go, I'm here to do something and I have a competing commitment, right? Based on a big assumption. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's quite profound. Again, but not before bed, Amiel. Quick correction. This word entelechy, you said coaches use it. I've been a coach for 23 years. I've heard the term twice, and they both were in the past. And I see Akasha laughing. They both were in the past week. And so don't let my friend Steve March or any of these guys fool you. This is not a common term.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
I got to correct that error.
That's fine. I stand corrected. I stand corrected.
Okay, no, I know you. It was generous for you to say that, but I don't even know how to pronounce it. Okay, so my question is the choice of open society as a goal, which both seems absolutely resonant with me, and also as you point out, in the context of, say, climate change, humble but necessary. So my question for you, and this is sort of a challenge, a friendly challenge, is what else did you consider, if anything, as you were writing that essay, and why open society over those others?
Well, I suppose I'm looking for a goal that speaks to large scale endeavor, right? So not necessarily the entire planet, but the question of what are the underlying principles of governance that we need to try to achieve or protect in the short to medium term. And you can use words like democracy, but open society is useful for the obvious opposite of closed society. Because what you're witnessing in Russia, particularly in its treatment of Ukraine, but what you're also witnessing in a creeping way in many other countries of the world is a gradual usurping of individual and collective rights by the state, and a sort of, Chinese model in which the citizens there might be well looked after in some senses, but they exist primarily to serve the state and the imperatives of the state as the state sees them, rather than the state being there to look after, protect the citizens to live free lives as far as possible. There is another personal answer, which is I was an Open Society Fellow with the Open Society Foundations for over a year. And in that time, I actually grew quite weary of the term open society. And it's sort of like a falling back in love with something notion, because I came to realize that, and this is the Ukraine war helped a bit with this, so it might be of interest to Taras. You see, about, I don't know, 3 years ago or so, when I wrote this long essay called An Open Letter to the Human Rights Movement. And it was a kind of post-progressive essay. It was sort of like a kind of get real essay, but again, it was a commending for their effort. It wasn't saying, I'm not with you. It was saying, there's a fuller picture here you need to bring on board. But in that essay, I say, look, climate change has happened on liberalism's watch. The free life of jet setting to events in Austin, for example, or enjoying the multiple planet lifestyles that most of us enjoy with our cars and our homes and our diets that we have, and the very model of what it is to be free is to choose your own private ends, to consume what you will as long as you can afford it, and so forth. Beginning to realize how deeply problematic this was, because it cuts people off from the commons, from communal life. You don't have to become a fully fledged communitarian or communist to realize that there's something about the claim of the collective that we might have lost. And that was partly what the essay was about. It was about rights and responsibilities. It was about what are we obliged to do, not just what are we entitled to. And so that was a kind of challenge to open societies. However, fast forward to Ukraine fighting for their life, and you see there that they're fighting for things that we've taken for granted. They're fighting to uphold the dignity and value of the prerequisites for a free life, including the institutions that we have assumed to be jaded and tired and inadequate for purpose. So much of the inspiration from Ukraine for me is, not that open society is in every sense perfect, but it's a God sight better than the main alternative. Now, you might say it's not that simple. It's not just open society or closed society. There's other ways of living. And I do accept that. But there's also something to be said for the somewhat artificial binary to focus the attention. The difference between a world where, we're more or less free politically, even if we're spiritually unfree or psychologically unfree in a certain sense. But we're free in that we can go to the shops without having to show our ID card, that we're not getting surveillance and photographed and then lowering our credit score, that we're not getting people plundering our house and claiming it as our own because we don't have any right to that place. Our daughters and sisters and mothers are safe from brutality of invading soldiers. I do see it in quite Manichaean terms in that sense. Not in every sense, but there is a case for focusing the mind. Now, the only qualification I'd make is that when I speak of open societies, I don't mean a sort of 1950s model of election once in every 5 years and a market that's got some kind of state intervention. Open societies will have to completely transform themselves to be more deeply connected, technologically informed, ecologically savvy, and so forth. And that hasn't happened yet, but that's the kind of precondition that I see. So I chose it with a wink in the eye as a former Open Society fellow, but I genuinely believe it. I believe that fascism is a real and present danger to more countries than realize it, including my own, certainly including the US. It can happen in the blink of an eye, by which I mean a few months. And being vigilant against that is, I think, the right kind of vigilance more generally. It's like, okay, we got to protect the principles of open society, and for what? Where is the vision that we're going towards? So it's a two-part process. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got Eric, Taras, and then we'll have to call it a day, I think, unless anyone really wants to put their hand up now.
I'll be quick. This is delightful. More conversations. Justice and compassion. Those are the values that are sort of highest for me at the moment.
I'll reset. First, it feels that having this conversation, is one of the way to move towards something bright and beautiful, however we society see, and something that prevents such conversation from happening should be somehow limited. And I think Arthur Koestler was bringing this argument with Nazi Germany, that if we have a way for societal properties to develop that can prohibit conversation, that can prohibit free dialogue, this openness, we should somehow limit it. So it's on us, people who can have conversations politely and kindly, to protect ability to have such conversation. And that goes towards your, Jonathan, notion that maybe we don't need to be very austere on pushing the value of open society. I think we should, because coming from the naturalistic perspective or scientific perspective, only ecosystem that has diversity can flourish. If someone can block ecosystem diversity, if someone can say we create monoculture, let's say fascism, we create monoculture of wheat fields or only cows that are prevented to move and connect with other animals and plants, that's where we have major suffering, and that's where we have death of the system. And I see that that goal for the whole life. And you were bringing the vitality versus love. I don't see the dichotomy here or the struggle between them, because when life emerges from the simplicity to complexity, love emerges as the property of life, and they are just indistinguishable. Life and love and flourish, and they together move us to the future. And to chart that terrain, we have only 10 to the hundreds years to exist, if we believe in scientific picture of the world, which I do. So we have only this time, and that's it. Everything will die, everything, all gods, all universes. So we need to care of each other to the point of this 10 to the hundreds and sustain this diverse ecosystem of life and love and flourishing, and that's it. So we know where we're going to end. We need to accept that death, each of us personally, because it's going to be way sooner, but also death of the whole life of the universe. And if we have that in mind, then we can create this open society on the universal scale, some ecosystem that constantly engages with each other without creating dominative narrative. And then in that diverse ecosystem of consciousnesses, of varieties of everything, we can survive that time. That's it.
A man in a lecture hall giving a lecture about something that Taras just spoke about, the ultimate extinction of all life in the known universe. And he said the life in the known universe will be extinct in about 3 billion years. And a guy at the back said, excuse me, what did you just say? How many years? He goes, 3 billion years. He goes, oh, phew. For a minute there, I thought you said 3 million years.